class. It's Dr. Miller. We are in week 5 of 9 of this class, halfway through. Not that I'm counting.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Today is the day in which we get to the book of Numbers. We've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. 4th book of the Bible is the book of Numbers. And it is called the book of Numbers because the Israelites took a census. They counted how many people belonged to the nation of Israel. And they did that largely for military purposes, so they would know how many soldiers they had if they had to go off to war. And so we're going to look at the book of Numbers and some of the themes of the book of Numbers and what it says about the relations between religion and politics, because that has followed the history of the Judeo-Christian world, and it's still a very important issue that's debated today. So we're going to look at some of that. First of all, I want to share with you, though, a God sighting that I had this week. God sightings are moments where you see God working in your life or in the life of someone around you. And I saw God work in an amazing way just in the last week or two. And I wanted to share that with you. I have somebody in my congregation who needed surgery on his knee. His knee had swollen up large, and they went in and they tested it. And they said, well, you have an infection in there. And so we need to do surgery. But before the surgery, I went over to his house and I prayed for him. And I prayed that the infection would go away. So they went ahead and did the surgery and cleaned out his knee. And then what they do is they do a sort of a test on the things that they take out from your knee, and they grow what's called a culture. And after a few days, the culture should grow and tell them things about what the infection was. Well, 3 days after taking the culture, there was nothing that had grown. There was no sign of an infection at all. And they knew that he had had an infection. That's why his knee swelled up. They had tested for it, and they needed to do surgery because of it. But after the surgery, they could find no sign that there was an infection there at all. His wife had been a nurse throughout the course of her life. And she talked to the doctors and she said, now, wait a minute. Why would there be no infection now? What do you think happened? And the doctor said, honestly, we don't know. And so the truth is God shows up in amazing ways when we pray. And that helps build my faith when I see God at work that way. And I hope it helps build your faith as well. If you've never prayed to God before, then trusting in Jesus and beginning to have a conversation with him can lead you to some amazing experiences in this life. And that was my God sighting of the week. Now let's get to work and study the book of Numbers. First of all, I want to give you an outline of what the book is all about.
The book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into this story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God's presence moves, they're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
We begin the second section of the book with enthusiasm as they leave Mount Sinai and travel up to Paran. God's with them, everything's organized. This is going to be great.
But it's not great. After just 3 days on the road, the people are complaining about their hunger and thirst, and then even Moses' brother and sister start bad-mouthing him in front of all the people.
Not a great start. But now we're into the third section, the wilderness of Paran. This is where they send the 12 spies to scout out the promised land. 2 of those spies come back and they're really optimistic.
But the other 10 are freaked out, and they don't trust God, and they go around saying, we're going to get annihilated in there. And so they start a mutiny, and they try to appoint a new leader who's going to take all the people back to Egypt. And so basically, they are refusing to go into the promised land, and God honors their choice. He says that this generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their kids will get to enter the promised land.
You know, this story here gets brought up many times in the Bible by different authors.
Yeah, and it always serves as a reminder that while God remains faithful to his people and his promises, he will honor their choices. He'll let them waste their whole lives if they choose to live in rebellion.
Okay, so the trip's been a disaster so far.
And it gets worse here in this fourth section as they're traveling to Moab. Even Moses has a moment of rebellion and is disqualified from entering the promised land. Then there's another rebellion among the people that results in this snake attack. And what makes all these rebellions even worse is that every step of the way, God has been providing. He's been offering forgiveness. He's been giving them food and water and this crazy stuff called manna.
Yeah, what is that stuff?
Yeah, no idea. But in spite of all this, they keep complaining, and they say that they wish they had died in slavery in Egypt.
If I was God, I would just give up on these guys.
You would think. But that's what makes this story in the final section so surprising. Israel has just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab, he's freaked out that this huge group of people is traveling through his land. So he hires this pagan sorcerer named Balaam to pronounce curses on them.
This guy means business.
Yeah, and so Balaam, he says, okay, I'm going to pray to the Hebrew God, and let's see what happens. And 3 different times he attempts to curse them, but each time he finds that he can utter only blessing. Most surprising is the last blessing, where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. And this king is somehow going to be connected to God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through this family. So here's Israel rebelling down in the camp, totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting and even blessing them.
The book ends here in Moab. Israel's getting ready to go into the promised land. They count up everyone again, just like at the beginning. They're leaving the old generation behind, including Moses.
But before they leave Moses, he gives them his last words of warning and wisdom. And that speech is what the next book, Deuteronomy, is all about.
So here's the book of Numbers. We left off after the book of Exodus. Remember, Moses has received the 10 Commandments. He's received the instructions for building the tabernacle. They're well on their way into the wilderness. Numbers picks up right where Exodus leaves off, and they leave Sinai. And as I said, they first take a census. They count how many fighting soldiers they have. Excluded from the count are the Levites, the priests, because the priest's job is to take care of the temple, and they're not going to be soldiers. So the Levites are exempt. The count shows that there's about 600,000 Israelites, a huge number of people wandering through the desert, and maybe, I think it's 23,000 Levites. So that's the count. As the story goes along, we find out that the people often complain about Moses. This has happened before in the book of Exodus, and it continues on in the book of Numbers. They've left their homeland in Egypt, and now they're wandering in search of their promised land. But they complain all the way. They've been set free from slavery, but immediately they forget it, and they are upset that they're out in the middle of nowhere. They complain to Moses with things like, "Why did you bring us out here in the desert to die? Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out here?" And various uprisings happen in which people try to unseat Moses. But God pours out various punishments on his people when they rebel against Moses. At one point, they're punished with fire. At one point, they're punished with a plague, and like 14,000 of them die. Miriam, at one point, gets leprosy and has to leave the village for 7 days, and then she is restored. But at various points along the way, it's shown that anytime someone rebels against Moses, terrible things happen to them. Now that ushers in sort of a sense for what's going on in terms of the government of the Israelites. They have been slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. All they know is a Pharaoh who rules over them, and their responsibility to simply blindly obey the Pharaoh. Moses has come in like a deliverer to set God's people free, but they don't yet know what freedom is or how to manage their freedom. So when they look at Moses, they see another Pharaoh. Remember when Moses went up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, the Israelites down below took all of their jewelry and melted it down and made a gold statue of a calf. And that was not happenstance. In Egypt, when a pharaoh died, they appealed to the bull god, Apis, to help them find the next pharaoh. And since Moses was gone up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights without explanation, they assumed their pharaoh was gone, and they went through the same ritual they had always gone through, appealing to their bull god to provide for them another pharaoh. So there's still a kind of dictatorship that exists in the wilderness. God's people have been set free from foreign slavery, but they still only know the mindset of slaves. The form of government that we would say Moses is practicing out in the wilderness is called theocracy. Theocracy is when God rules over the people by speaking through a single individual. God speaks to Moses, and Moses dictates God's law to everyone else on all matters, including the death penalty. So if Moses says, God's law says you have to die, there was no one else to appeal to. Moses got to decide such things. So Moses was the ultimate decision maker in this theocracy. God spoke to Moses, Moses spoke to everyone else. And anytime the people rebelled against Moses, terrible disasters befell them. And this is a way of saying God defended Moses' leadership even in the face of challenges. However, Moses does face one challenge that's not a threat to his authority, it's a threat to his stamina. Moses gets to the point where he is exhausted because he cannot govern all the people and hear all their complaints and decide all their legal cases. There are 600,000 of them. And most likely, that's just the fighting men. There's probably an equal number of women. There's a huge number of people gathered around Moses. So Moses' uncle Jethro comes to him, father-in-law Jethro comes to him and says, you need to appoint other people to help make decisions for you. You need to appoint people who will help govern the people underneath your authority. So Moses appoints 70 elders who will help with all the decision making. This becomes sort of an important precedent in the history of Judeo-Christian leadership, because thereafter, people who are appointed to the place of supreme leadership will often then appoint a second tier of leaders who govern on their behalf, middle managers, as it were. And so Moses appoints 70 elders. In the Jewish practice by the first century, they have a supreme court that governs on behalf of all of Israel. Supposedly it is overseen by the high priest, but there are 70 elders on the Jewish Supreme Court, which is known as the Sanhedrin. So when you read the stories of Jesus, you'll see that someone came to Jesus from the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is that 70 elders who are still governing over Israel some 1,500 years or more after Moses. So it sets a precedent that then sticks with the believers ever after. In the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul goes and starts churches, he appoints elders to govern over the church after he plants the church and moves on. So the process of establishing elders goes back a long way and has stuck with Christianity. Even in churches today, it's not uncommon to find boards of elders who govern over churches. So that's Moses' second challenge to his leadership, is that he can't stand the challenge of managing so many people. Still, their progress through the wilderness continues, and their goal is to arrive in their promised land, which is known as Canaan, the land in which Abraham and Sarah once stood hundreds of years before, and that they are supposed to inherit. And so they come near the land of Canaan, and they send spies into the land. This is in chapter 13 of Numbers. They send a dozen spies into the land. And the spies come back, led by two guys, Joshua and Caleb, who say the land is flowing with milk and honey, which were signs of fertility, signs of a fertile land, right? If there's milk, then that means there are animals that are providing food for the people, and honey is this special treat that can be found in the wilderness. And so to say a land is flowing with milk and honey, to you and me sounds disgusting. It sounds sticky and messy and smelly. But that was actually a word of promise. They came back and said, the land is flowing with milk and honey, but the land is filled with giants. The people inside the land are huge, and there's no way we could fight them or conquer them. And so the Israelites are too afraid to enter into the promised land. And as a punishment for their cowardice, God causes them to wander in the wilderness another 40 years. They spend all kinds of time wandering around in the wilderness because they weren't faithful to God. So there's a real contrast in the book of Numbers between the older generation that is unfaithful and the younger generation that obeys. And there's sort of an implication that the older generation must die off in the desert before the new generation can go in and take the land. There's a sense that God is doing away with the old in order to bring in a new order. Jesus at one point will say, you can't put new wine in old wineskins, because when the wine releases gases and expands, it'll break the wineskins. You have to put new wine in new wineskins. And there's sort of that message in Numbers that the older generation had not been faithful and obedient, and they have to sort of pass in the wilderness, and then the new generation will come in. Now, the big crisis in the book of Numbers comes in chapter 20, when the people again are complaining against Moses, and they complain for lack of water. And God tells Moses to speak to a rock to produce water. But Moses is angry, and he hits the rock with his staff. And in some way or another, Moses is then accused of not having been faithful. And so God tells him, you're not going to enter the promised land. You're going to get right up to the edge, and that's going to be the end of your life. And then your successor, who will be Joshua, will lead the people into the promised land. There's a lot of debate about what Moses really did wrong. He wasn't told not to hit the rock with his staff, but there's sort of the implication that somehow he went overboard in doing that, or maybe he reacted out of anger, or he didn't do exactly what God wanted. But in one way or another, Moses was punished for not being completely obedient to God, and the punishment was that he led the people through the wilderness, but he didn't enter in. He was buried in the wilderness before the people go in the land. Now there's a funny passage in chapter 22.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
So in Numbers 22, a king named Balak sees the Israelites and is afraid that this huge people will take over his land and drive him out. So he summons a prophet named Balaam. And Balaam goes to see King Balak. And on the way, an angel stands in front of Balaam's donkey to stop him from getting where he's going. And the donkey can see the angel, but Balaam cannot. And so the donkey turns off the road to get away from the angel. And Balaam beats the donkey for leaving the road. And in this sort of bizarre story in Numbers, the donkey turns around to Balaam and begins to speak and says, "Why are you beating me?" And then Balaam's eyes are open and he can see the angel and he realizes he's being blocked from going. Just sort of a strange, goofy story in the book of Numbers. And then Balaam goes to Balak, and Balak says, "I want you to curse these people." And Balaam says, "I can only say what God puts in my mouth. I can't just curse them because you want to curse them. So let me pray. Let me say what God tells me to say." And so Balaam stands up above the Israelites and he blesses them, and he says good things over them. He promises them good things. And King Balak is then so angry because Balaam was supposed to curse the Israelites, and instead he's blessed them. And but Balaam says, "I can only say what God tells me to say." And so there's this sort of foreshadowing, this promise that the Israelites are going to prosper. And sure enough, in the books to come, they are going to enter into the promised land and take it, and that will be theirs. That actually doesn't happen in the Pentateuch. That happens in the 6th book of the Bible, in Joshua. So that will come later. But that's sort of an overview of the book of Numbers. Now, there are sections that I have skipped over in which there are commandments for how the priests are to behave, how they're to go about their rituals, the kinds of laws the Israelites are supposed to follow, the purity rituals that they're supposed to keep. There are interspersed in this story various commandments that sort of show up in ways that break the narrative. Some historians have argued that that means an editor who was a priest got his hands on the book of Numbers and went back and inserted things that he wanted in there in order to favor the priests. That theory, as I've told you, was popular for about 100 years between the 1800s and the 1900s, but that theory has largely fallen out of favor, and not many people believe in it anymore. But that was a dominant theory, that Numbers was edited by a priestly editor who added all the sections about what priests were supposed to do. So anyway, that is a brief summary of the book of Numbers. Now let's make sure we include a vocabulary list in this week's lesson. I'm going to give you 8 words today, and you need to know them for next week. You'll see these, for you students who are in my university class, you'll see these on your notes. Number 1, a census. A census is a count of the population. It is a way of assessing how many people live in a certain area or belong to a certain group. We take a census in the United States every few years, and it tells us about who lives here and where they're moving, and it helps us determine some major governmental issues, like how many representatives each of the states get in Congress. Because remember, every state gets 2 senators. 50 states, 2 senators, 100 senators total. But the House of Representatives is based on the population of various states. And the most recent census showed that California is getting smaller. People are moving out of California in droves. And as a consequence, California gets 1 less representative, 1 less vote in the House of Representatives, because the population is shrinking. And that's what happens when you tax people through the nose. California keeps taking money away from people in order to redistribute it, and as a consequence, people are sick of it and moving away. So now California gets a little less voice in government, and that's how things work. And that's a consequence of the census. The census is a way of counting people. Number 2, A descendant is anybody in your bloodline who comes after you. So your son or your daughter, your grandson or your granddaughter, your great-grandson or your great-granddaughter, those are all of your descendants. Number 3 is ancestor. And an ancestor goes the other way. An ancestor is anybody in your bloodline who came before you. But there's sort of an implication that it starts with people a ways back. You wouldn't normally call your parents your ancestors, although they sort of are. You might call your grandparents your ancestors, but you're probably talking about at least a generation before that, your great-grandparents or even further back. Those are your ancestors, the people to whom you can trace your identity. Number 4 is theocracy. And remember, we talked about this when we were talking about Moses. A theocracy is a government led by God who usually speaks to one single individual who rules in all matters, including the death penalty. A theocracy. And number 5 is theology. Theology is the study of God. You notice both of those words have theo at the beginning. That's because the Greek word for God is theos. So theology is the study of God, and theocracy is a government led by God. Theo meaning God, arche meaning ruler. God is the ruler. Number 6, covenant. A covenant is an agreement between two people, sort of like a contract. In the Bible, God makes several covenants with his people. There's a covenant with Adam and Eve, a covenant with Noah, a covenant with Moses, a covenant with David, and finally a new covenant with Jesus. And it's an agreement that God establishes to say, this is how I will relate to you, and this is what I expect of you. The covenant with Moses was that I will give you the laws, and if you follow the laws, I will bless you, and if you break the laws, I will punish you. Number 7 is the word sin. Sin is a common enough word in the American vocabulary, but it's important to understand what we're talking about when we say the word. Some people think sins are a list of bad behaviors, but sin is a little bit bigger than that. Sin is any time we don't do God's will. Either we do something that he doesn't want, or we don't do something that he does want. And that's what's called sin. In Christian doctrines, sin is something that's inevitable for human beings. We are all born into a sinful world, and we are born with the contamination of sin. We're never innocent from infancy on. Finally, number 8, we have to include the word genocide. Genocide is the attempt to kill out an entire group of people, often an ethnic group of people. We refer to the Holocaust in World War II as an attempted genocide of the Jewish people. But in the Hebrew scriptures, we see a number of attempts at genocide, where either a population tries to wipe out the Israelites, or the Israelites try to wipe out another population. And that is called genocide. And those are the 8 vocabulary words for this week.
The Book of Numbers. This 4th book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and he entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near his holy presence in the tabernacle. So the book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised Abraham. Now, the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now, the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness, and immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the promised land. Now, you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion, and they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now, as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the promised land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol, but it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab, and the first main part of the section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now, it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling. But up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness. That's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
Now, one of the more interesting biblical themes that arises from the book of Numbers is the story of the relation between church and state, between religion and politics. In the ancient world, everything was a monarchy and a dictatorship of one kind or another. And Egypt was no exception. Israel was no exception. They tended to have one supreme leader who governed usually on behalf of God or the gods. There were experiments in democracy in Greece. They talk about ancient Athens being a bit of a democracy. It was not really. It was a bit of an oligarchy ruled over by the Senate. But there were attempts at allowing the people to have a voice. But nonetheless, by and large, the world around was governed by monarchs. And as I said, in the case of Israel, the monarch reported to God and answered to God, and so that is called a theocracy. That's not just a product of the ancient world. There are Muslim nations today which are largely governed by Sharia law, which is Muslim law derived supposedly from the Quran, and those countries want to be ruled over by God. In fact, some of those countries and some Muslims believe that the world will be and should be one day ruled over through Muslim leadership that follows the Quran and enforces God's law on the entire world. There were certainly, through the Middle Ages, there was certainly a view in Christian countries that that was supposed to happen through the governance of the church at Rome, although there was sort of an ambiguous relationship between the church and the state, because at certain points the Pope could call up armies, as could various kings. And so when conflict finally erupted after the Protestant Reformation, there was a sort of a division between the authority of the church and the authority of the state. But prior to the Reformation, there was generally a sense that one day the world might be ruled over by a king who answers to God and follows the teachings of the Bible. That's just largely died out. There are not a large number of nations seeking to establish a Christian state, whereas there are many Muslim nations seeking to establish a Muslim state. There's a shift that happens in the book of 1 Samuel. The Israelites move into their promised land. They're ruled over by judges who sit in the seat of Moses. But they look at the nations around them, and they realize everybody's got a king. Assyria has a king, Babylon has a king, Moab has a king, everybody's got a king but us. And we want a king. And there's this fascinating passage in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where the people go to Samuel and say, we want a king. And Samuel goes to God and says, the people want a king. And God says, here's what's going to happen. The king's going to rule over you. He's going to conscript your sons into his armies. He's going to take your daughters and make them bake in the kitchen. And he'll take an enormous amount of taxes by which to enjoy himself. And when you call out for me for relief from your king, I will not answer. And Samuel goes back and tells the people, you really don't want a king. And the Israelites answer, yeah, we really do. And so God says to Samuel, listen to them and give them a king. God, in his humility, surrenders to the will of his people and gives them something that's going to be bad for them. And there's a deep theology there that ultimately God's worst punishment for us is not throwing a lightning bolt from heaven and striking us down. God's worst punishment for us is letting us have our own way. It's what happened to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when they were free to eat the fruit if they wanted to. And in the book of Romans, chapter 1, it says that that's exactly what's happened in the modern world, that God has surrendered people to their own freedoms, and as they've chased after their own lusts and desires, they've wrecked their lives and wrecked the world. But at that point, Israel shifts to a monarchy ruled over by a king. Their first king, Saul, is a terrible king, and God eventually replaces Saul with David. God actually favors David. And despite the fact that it was not God's plan to have a king rule over Israel, not what God desired and not what God thought would be good for the people, nonetheless, God uses David and shows favor to David. He establishes a covenant with David and promises that someone in David's bloodline will be the king forever. Now, when it gets around to Jesus, about 1,000 years after David, Jesus has very little interest in government. Jesus makes no prescriptions about who should be king or who should be Caesar. He has very little commentary to offer on what kind of government is best. In fact, the world around Jesus expects Jesus to be a king, and he rejects their kingship. It says in John chapter 6, they tried to make him king by force, but he slipped off through the crowds. James and John come to him saying, "Can we sit at your right and left-hand side?" And what they're asking is, "Can we be your vice president and secretary of state?" And he says, "It's not mine to appoint those things." So essentially, there's an expectation that Jesus will be an earthly kind of king. When the Romans crucify Jesus, they place a crown of thorns on his head and put a purple robe around his shoulders, which was a royal color. And then they put a sign on his cross that says, "The King of the Jews." And it's a way of mocking rebels who would try to throw Rome out and establish their own kingship over Israel. The Romans mean to say, you will never have your own king. We get to appoint your king. Ironically, because Jesus actually never sought out the kind of kingship they were rejecting. Throughout most of the Middle Ages, in not just the Western world, but around the world, most governments were ruled over by kings, by monarchs, dictators of one kind or another. Tyrants and generals who became powerful and drove out previous leaders or succeeded their fathers and ruled by force. It was actually not until the late 1700s that the United States and France began experimenting in democracy on a large scale. And that experiment is still playing out in our world today. It seems to have worked fabulously well compared to its alternatives. It harkens back in little ways to ancient Athens, but democracy on the scale of America is nothing compared to democracy that they had in a tiny little city-state in ancient Greece. Now, through all that, there's been a curiosity surrounding how the church should relate to the state. Many Christians have thought that the church's job is to fight for the culture and vote Christians into power and make sure they control the culture. The problem is, Jesus never said anything of the sort. Jesus never advocated for kingship. He didn't want it for himself, and he didn't tell his people to go seeking it. In America, this is very deep because it goes back to our Genesis. America was founded when people left Europe seeking freedom. Among other things, they sought the freedom of religion. In England, there was an Anglican church, a Church of England. And if you were English, you had to belong to that church. As Catholics and Protestants had fought wars with each other over who got to control which country, a lot of people longed for religious freedom. So the American colonies were founded in pursuit of religious freedom. The First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the free expression of religion. And so very deep in the history of America is the belief that America's religious practices should be free from government interference. It would be a mistake to assume that what the separation of church and state means is that religion should not have a say in matters of state. That's actually not what the Constitution says at all. It says that religion should be protected from the state. The state can't dictate one religion or another. Everyone is free to practice religion as they so choose. What's happened in the United States is actually very remarkable because the Supreme Court, especially in recent years, has asserted more and more strongly that religious organizations should be free to do what they want. They can hire and fire whom they want. They can choose how to carry out their business practices. Most recently, there have been debates over whether or not Catholic adoption agencies can refuse to allow same-sex couples to adopt children. And thus far, the Supreme Court has continued to side with religious freedom. How that will play out in the long run, nobody knows. But in the meantime, very deep in America's genetics is a separation of church and state that protects the church from state governance. Here's how I think the Christian church needs to think about politics. Generally in history, any time Christians have been in power, they have abused it just like everybody else. People in power tend to abuse power. Jesus never sought out power. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus puts a servant's towel on his arm and gets down on his feet and gets down on his knees and washes his disciples' feet. He says, "I have come to serve you, so you go and serve others. No servant is greater than his master. And so if I have washed your feet, you wash other people's feet. You are servants as well." In that sense, Jesus sets out a model of leadership which does not seek to conquer. And Christians who have sought to win culture wars or vote in elected officials who will enforce their policies have essentially abandoned Jesus' teachings that God's people are here to serve. If Christians lived wholehearted lives of service, if we sought only to love and to bless other people, we wouldn't have to campaign for a voice in society. Everybody would long to hear what we have to say. Instead, we've acted exactly like secular people. We've acted like people who don't believe in God and who are afraid of losing control over the world and who believe that taking control by force is therefore somehow acceptable. I think that's an utter rejection of what Jesus taught. Jesus taught people to love and to serve, to give their lives away for other people, and not to seek to take power in any way. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That runs throughout Jesus' teachings. So ultimately, I think Christians do far better to seek to make the name of Jesus known instead of trying to find a political representative who will in some way represent some vague form of the teachings of Jesus or try to enforce religious ideologies or defend the church as though the church needed political defending. The places in the world in which the church has been most persecuted has actually been the places in which the church has spread the most and the fastest. Author Philip Yancey says that the church in China today is spreading faster than it has in any region and in any era throughout history. And that's, I think, because the communist doctrine has been that God does not exist and that churches should be generally discouraged. Although China does allow for state churches, there really isn't the same sort of freedom of religion that people experience in the United States. And yet, the Christian church has spread rapidly in China. The Christian church is actually spreading in places like Iran, where it's illegal to convert to Christianity, where when you're born, Muslim is written on your birth certificate if your parents are Muslim. There are certain Muslim nations like Syria, where they write Muslim on your driver's license. It identifies you everywhere you go. And it's in places like that where the Christian church, persecuted though it is, continues to spread. And so I think Christians do better not to seek to take power, but instead to surrender power, even to the point of the cross, in order to convince the world that God really loves us and we put our faith entirely in Him and not at all in ourselves.
Right, so what you need to know is how we get from Jesus here to the great big church, all the great big churches we have today. No problem. So, Jesus Christ. Parables, miracles, love your enemies, death and resurrection, amazing. He had lots of followers, or disciples, but these 12 guys were specially chosen by Jesus and he made Peter their leader. When Jesus went up to heaven, this lot, well, one was replaced, another story. This lot continued to spread Jesus' teaching, but not everyone was happy about it. The Romans, for a start, who'd already crucified Jesus and felt that should have been an end to it. And the Jewish authorities employed people like Saul here to stamp out the new religion. But then Saul had a vision and heard Jesus. "Why are you giving me a hard time? What's your problem?" So Saul changed his name to Paul and spent the rest of his life spreading the new religion instead. Paul and Peter and the rest of the 12 are known as the Apostles, which is Greek for messengers. The people who believed the Apostles' message began to meet together, and someone in Antioch came up with a nickname for them, Christians, because they followed Christ. Paul and Peter and a few others wrote letters to these groups of Christians, called churches, and you can read some of them in the Bible. Around about now, the first book about Jesus' life was written. It's called Mark, and you can read that in the Bible too. In the following 50 years or so, the books of Matthew, Luke and John appeared, all with a slightly different take on Jesus' life. Most Christians believe that Peter became the very first bishop of Rome, a dangerous place to be. Fire destroyed most of the city, and rumours spread that the Emperor Nero had started it to clear the land for a massive palace. He needed someone else to blame, so he picked on the Christians. No one liked Christians. Everyone thought they were superstitious because they didn't follow the Roman religion, or even the Jewish one. They were probably criminals because their leader, Jesus, had been executed. And they were cannibals because they ate bodies and drank blood. They didn't. It was the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, of course. All a misunderstanding, but the upshot was that thousands of Christians were persecuted and killed. Nero used them as human candles, and many more met gory deaths in the circus. Not that kind of circus, that kind of circus. Peter and Paul were probably executed around now. The story goes that Peter was crucified upside down and Paul was beheaded. The other apostles were all killed too, apart from John, who was the only one to die of old age. But Christianity continued to grow. The churches were run by bishops, and the first ones, along with other Christian thinkers of the time, are known as the Church Fathers. Most of them were killed as well. Right from the start, Christians argued about what to believe and how to behave. One of the Church Fathers, a man called Origen, even castrated himself because he wanted to live a pure life. But it didn't catch on. In Britain, Christianity probably arrived with Roman converts trying to escape the persecution. Some hope. One of the first British Christians we know about, a man called Alban, was beheaded for being a Christian. Then a general in the Roman army called Constantine became emperor, and he'd recently converted to Christianity. Or so he said. His story was that he'd had a vision of a Christian symbol called the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ in Greek. He heard the words, "By this sign, conquer," so he got his soldiers to paint it on their shields, beat anyone who fancied a fight, and became emperor. But his conversion might have been a crafty political move. Constantine wanted everyone to work together, but the Roman religion got in the way because different people worshipped different gods. He saw Christianity, a religion in which everyone worshipped the same god, as a good way to unite the empire. Little did he know how things would turn out. Constantine passed a law that allowed Christians freedom to worship without persecution. This meant that the bishops could get together to decide exactly what they all believed. They drew up the first draft of the Nicene Creed, a statement of their beliefs that churches still use today. This big bishopy get-together was called an ecumenical council, and there were 7 in all because the arguments went on and on, mainly about Jesus. Some people believed he was just a man, some people believed he was God and had disguised himself as a man, some people believed he was two beings, God and man in one body. The councils eventually decided that Jesus was totally God and totally man at the same time. Christianity was made the Roman Empire's official religion by the Emperor Theodosius, who also split the empire in two. And despite the bishop's efforts to keep everyone together, the church was beginning to split up as well. The Nestorians left at the Council of Ephesus because they believed that Jesus was just a man and God's Spirit had come to live inside him. More people, known today as the Oriental Orthodox churches, left at the Council of Chalcedon. They didn't like the council's description of Jesus, of one substance with the Father and at the same time of one substance with man, because they thought it sounded too much like what the Nestorians had said. They also didn't like how powerful the Bishop of Rome was becoming. For a long time now, the Bishop of Rome, also called the Pope, had been gaining power, partly because he'd inherited the authority of the Apostle Peter, but mainly because those guys in Rome were really good at organising everyone. The Western Church and the Eastern Church were slowly drifting apart. They just didn't talk anymore. Most people in the West spoke Latin, and most people in the East spoke Greek, and the East didn't like having to do what the Pope said all the time, and then the West added some words to the Nicene Creed without asking the East. They were living separate lives. For a while, the Eastern Church was more powerful than the West, which had to cope with marauding Vandals, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Dark Ages. By the time the West had sorted itself out, the East had challenges of its own as a new religion called Islam spread out from Arabia. In the West, Charlemagne was now ruling, well, most of it. He gave himself the title Holy Roman Emperor and got the Pope to crown him. This gave the Pope even more power, because from now on you couldn't be emperor unless the Pope said so. Finally, it happened. The Great Schism. The church split in two, the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, obviously, and the Roman Catholic Church in the West. The Roman Catholic Church became more and more powerful, while the Eastern Orthodox Church began to feel more and more squeezed out by the rise of Islam. This is where the Crusades come in. The Pope sent thousands of soldiers to the east to claim Jerusalem for Christianity, but the so-called Crusaders left a trail of destruction across Europe before they got anywhere near a battlefield. The Muslim leaders fought back, and over the next 150 years there were 6 more big crusades while the two sides struggled for control of the Holy Land. Eventually, the Crusaders gave up and went home. But the fact that the Pope now had the power to send soldiers to war shows that something somewhere had gone very wrong. Even your local priests were getting too big for their boots. Church services were in Latin, and the Bible had been translated into Latin, but by now only educated people like priests could understand Latin, so everyone else had to trust that what they said the Bible said was what the Bible really said. Some priests had seen an opportunity here, and had started to charge people to forgive their sins, placing themselves firmly between God and everyone else like holy bouncers. A professor at Oxford University called John Wycliffe argued that it was time for the church to clean up its act, to be reformed. He translated the Bible into English so that everyone could read it for themselves and make up their own minds. It didn't go down well with those in charge, and his Bibles were burnt. It took a long time for an actual Reformation to kick off, but eventually a German priest called Martin Luther wrote a list of 95 theses, things he thought were wrong with the church, and nailed them to the door of an actual church in Wittenberg. The Pope sacked him, which Luther didn't mind because priests couldn't get married, and if he wasn't a priest anymore... A group of nuns had written him some fan mail, so he smuggled them out of their convent in herring barrels and married one of them, after she'd had a long bath. The people who protested against the church and its teachings became known as Protestants. Other big names included John Calvin in France and Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland. But they argued forever about what to believe instead, so very soon there were different groups of Protestants protesting. England remained officially Roman Catholic, and it was dangerous to be anything else. William Tyndale made himself so unpopular with his Protestant ideas that he had to leave the country. He translated the New Testament into English, and copies were smuggled back home to help Protestant feelings grow. Then King Henry VIII decided to marry Anne Boleyn, but he was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Divorce was out of the question back then, so Henry asked the Pope to annul his marriage instead, which would mean that the marriage had never been a real marriage in the first place. The Pope said no, but Henry had met a friendly English priest called Thomas Cranmer and made him Archbishop of Canterbury, so Thomas was more than happy to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine and marry him off to Anne. The Pope was very cross, so Henry left the Roman Catholic Church and made himself head of a new Church of England. The Roman Catholics realised they had to do something before everyone became a Protestant, and so the Counter-Reformation began. Catholic bishops got together for the Council of Trent, where they decided to keep their traditions, but made rules to stop priests conning people out of their hard-earned cash. The Church of England was still very like the Roman Catholic Church, just without the Pope. But when Henry died, his 9-year-old son became King Edward VI, and he allowed Thomas Cranmer to make the Church of England more Protestant. Cranmer wrote a list of 39 articles, which spelt out what the Church stood for, and stands for today, and wrote the Book of Common Prayer, which some churches still use. But the fiercely Roman Catholic Queen Mary I reunited England with the Pope, and had lots of Protestants burnt at the stake, including our friend Thomas Cranmer, earning herself the nickname Bloody Mary. Then Mary died, Elizabeth I became Queen, and she made England Protestant again. Next came James I, who was the first monarch of England, Wales, Ireland and Scotland. He was a big fan of Protestantism, and even published his own translation of the Bible. As European empires spread throughout the world, so did Christianity, and churches sent out missionaries to convert people in those hard-to-reach places. The Protestants continued to, protest, and there have been various offshoots over the years, from churches like the Quakers and Methodists, who have fairly mainstream beliefs, to groups like the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ, known as Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have more distinct beliefs of their own. In 1962, the Roman Catholic Church held a council, known as the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, which brought in some big changes. Church services, which had always been in Latin, were now to be in the language of the people. And so we continue to the present day, with churches of all different kinds all over the place. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and ever-increasing numbers of Protestant churches, Lutherans, Calvinists, the Church of England, Methodists, Quakers, Baptists, United Methodist Church, Pentecostals. You have to wonder what Jesus would say about it all.